Hello. Thank you very much for joining us this morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world, here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And thank you to Stephen Feldstein, and whose idea this panel was and who was organizing it, and to our other panelists, Mara Vistendahl and Sonia Falero. And thanks also to Marissa at Carnegie, who's been helping put this together. So we are here to talk about nationalism and technology and international relations, in particular about the September issue of MIT Technology Review, which all of our panelists contributed to, which aims to look at the future of international relations through a technological lens, particularly with all the inflections caused by the disruption of the global pandemic we're all living through this year. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to sort of speak briefly about what they wrote for the issue. I hope that you will all check it out online afterwards, not while people are speaking. And then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves as the panelists and amongst you, the audience. Please do submit your questions, whether on YouTube chat or tweeting at the @ Carnegie DCG. Thank you again, and I look forward to hearing what everybody has to say and to the discussion. I think we'll start out with a few minutes from Steve.
Great, thank you, Constantine. It's really great to be here, and it's nice to also be in the same virtual room with Sonia and Mara, whose work I've followed and read closely, including in this issue, but who I haven't had a chance to meet in person or virtually yet. So this is a great opportunity for me as well. My article talked about the kind of broader context for technonationalism, what it represents, what kind of trends are sort of driving this idea. So I'll spend a few minutes kind of talking through what I laid out in my piece, and hopefully that sets the stage for Mara, Sonia, and our broader conversation as well. When I sort of set out to think about what this piece was and what nationalism means, and really what role technology is playing in terms of its interaction with geopolitics, really what I started centering around more and more is the fact that the role of technology and technology itself has become a crucial component of national power, and that this applies both internally as well as externally. So what this means from a domestic internal standpoint is that digital means to enhance political power, oftentimes in the form of political repression, are an increasingly important component of how regimes reinforce their political rule. Externally, what this means is that technology is becoming an increasingly contested area as states view technological power as a key means to bolstering national power, alongside traditional military power, economic or latent power, or even size / demographics. So what I think this has resulted in is a paradigm of technonationalism where countries subscribe to several different principles, one of which is that an early technological lead will provide countries with a first mover advantage, and that dominance in certain technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, gives an edge in other fields. And so I think in some respects, this has really sort of driven, some of the movement in terms of this being a major issue of contestation. Now, one of the things I think we've seen right now is increasing fragmentation in the digital ecosystem. So, in one respect, we can look at China leading efforts to chip away at the normative rules that have largely been set by liberal democracies to govern the internet and our digital ecosystem. And you can see the creation of an alternate digital ecosystem, one that is holding increasing appeal to other countries like Russia, Iran, and other authoritarian regimes. Now, the US hasn't done itself any favors either. I think its capitalist surveillance model at times has alienated traditional partners, democratic partners, particularly in Europe. And so what you're then seeing is Europe taking distinct steps to potentially separate and constrain the power and influence of US platforms, particularly as it relates to data privacy. So I think one issue that a lot of people are grappling with is, are we seeing a bifurcation, which some have argued, in terms of a US-led sort of open democratic digital ecosystem and a Chinese-led authoritarian ecosystem, or instead are we witnessing more of a digital splintering, where you're seeing a number of different camps, as well as a number of different swing state areas, countries like India, Turkey, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and so forth, who are charting sort of a middle ground and borrowing aspects of China's model, as well as staying linked to the US-led one. I think that the answer is much closer to this splintering modality than one where it's a neat separation, kind of like what we saw in the Cold War between sort of a democratic-led alliance on the one hand and authoritarian one on the other hand. And so I think that will continue to make for a muddled terrain as we try to understand better what are the implications of technonationalism as we continue. Now, I think under the Trump administration in the United States, we've seen a lot of confusion and a lack of coherence when it comes to strategically trying to understand better where the U.S. is going and where it stands on certain key issues. And I think, for example, looking at the recent muddling as it relates to TikTok and the WeChat bans, I think exemplifies this sort of policy confusion. So, on the one hand, there are claims from the U.S. That these companies are unfairly stealing personal data, siphoning that data to the Chinese government, and helping to advance a Chinese authoritarian model. But the response by the U.S. to ban these specific acts, as opposed to even setting out a set of broader principles, in some respects sets up a contradiction where the U.S. appears to be mirroring some of the actions it has previously criticized the Chinese government for taking when it comes to banning specific applications. And I think it's also worth noting too that for countries like Russia, Iran, and others, this new digital terrain allows them to punch above their weight through asymmetric disinformation and manipulation strategies, which leads to further uncertainty and multipolarity in the international system. So I think what we're looking for at when it comes to technonationalism is further fragmentation along those lines and a diffusion of power as well as we continue kind of moving ahead. I don't want to take too much longer. I want to just mention one other point on the internal domestic side. One aspect of my research that I've taken a lot of time to think about is the proliferation and expansion of digital repression. So the use of this technology by authoritarian minded leaders, autocratically inclined countries, weak and illiberal democracies as a means to consolidate power. And I think that we continue to see the emergence of new technologies of surveillance, control, censorship, and manipulation as a key means that exacerbates what already is an autocratization movement worldwide. And so, it changes and varies depending on the context. In certain closed systems like China and Iran, you see digital technology providing greater opportunities for authorities to already buttress what's there in terms of repression. In hybrid regimes, digital technology provides new ways for governments to position in civil society in check, even while ostensibly allowing certain freedoms to persist. And this is relevant in places like Zimbabwe or Thailand, where there is a much more freedom available to citizens than you would see in Saudi Arabia or China, but there still very much is an authoritarian mindset in place. And then for weak democracies, and I'm interested to hear what Sonia has to say on this issue in particular, especially when it comes to tools like internet shutdowns, you see in places like the Philippines, like in India, like in Serbia, in Hungary, the use of these tools by governing authorities to accomplish their objectives in ways that I think are very troubling when it comes to balancing that with the rights of citizens. And I would say lastly, liberal democracies as well are not immune to these issues, although I think democratic norms and traditions do provide a relative bulwark when it comes to pushing back against these incursions. Let me stop here and turn it over, and thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thanks so much, Stephen. It was a really interesting overview and really sort of valuable set of perspectives. I think just to carry on the momentum, we'll turn to Sonia and ask you to just tell the audience a bit about the story you wrote for the issue, largely in Kashmir, talking about the shutdowns of the internet by the Indian government. You're still muted, Sonia. Sonia, you're muted. There you go.
All right, sorry about that. So the story that I wrote was about internet shutdowns, which is a relatively new phenomenon in India, but has really gathered pace since 2018. In 2018, there were 134 documented cases of shutdowns in India. And at the time, the government shut the internet on the excuse that they needed to do so to curb fake news that was leading to deadly confrontations and eventually, in fact, did kill several dozen people. And then the internet shutdowns continued, and in 2019, the government started to employ them for a completely different purpose, which was to stifle dissent. And that trend continued through the pandemic. It is ongoing. It has been used to arrest a large number of people, from PhD students to human rights activists. It is remarkable, not just because it has been continuing unabated for so long, but because, India, supposedly the world's largest democracy, now has more internet shutdowns than China, Iran, and Venezuela. The case of Kashmir, Konstantin, that you mentioned is different, and we can definitely go into that in detail. For years, Kashmir has been suffering a range of human rights violations as the people of Kashmir, continue their struggle for independence. And the shut internet is just one way in which the Indian government has tried to clamp down on them, has tried to stop their protest. And for all that time, people elsewhere in India didn't object, because there was a narrative in India that Kashmir was a community of violent dissenters. And therefore, if the government was shutting the internet, then, well, the government knows what it's doing. And then when the trend changed and the government started to employ those same methods in the rest of the country, in dozens of states, there was no way really that people could honestly say that the government's motives were what they claimed to be. So I investigate this deeply troubling phenomenon, all of which is riding on the back of a single colonial era law, and look at how people are responding, and this response has to be seen within the larger context of the fact that this democracy is now only in name. It is an incredibly illiberal culture. It is steadily sliding towards authoritarianism. There is no space for dissent. And people now are going to have to, first of all, live with the fact that you cannot go to the courts. India's famously activist courts, I think, are widely now acknowledged as no longer being independent. And secondly, I think people are now going to have to figure out how to respond not just to the internet shutdowns, but also to the stifling of dissent and to the illiberalism, because they're all connected. We will need a new form of protest that will actually take us all the way back to how we originally protested long before there were internet shutdowns, and back when India was under the British. We had wide sweeping protests across the country involving millions of people. And it's very possible that we're now going to have to reacquaint ourselves with that system of standing up for what is right.
Well, that is sobering and worrisome, but also very interesting to learn about. I want to come back to ask you quite a few questions about that, but first, want everybody to hear from Mara, who actually has two stories in the issue, one of which is adapted from her excellent new book, which I encourage everybody to get a copy of, called The Scientist and the Spy. And I will let Mara, rather than me, tell you about the themes of the book and the themes of the article, which is in part excerpted from that book in this issue, about espionage and counter-espionage, both on the part of American and Chinese authorities over the years. And also talking about an interview with Samantha Hoffman, who's done some very interesting work on the digital surveillance that the Chinese Communist Party is undertaking throughout the world. TikTok has been here in the U.S. In the news quite a bit recently, and I think that's it's one aspect of a much larger picture that that interview discussed. So I'll let Mara tell you more about it rather than me telling you what she did.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's good to be here with you all, and I guess I'll talk first about the piece that was adapted from my book. The book is called The Scientist and the Spy, and it's about a case of industrial espionage that was pursued by the FBI in Iowa. It spanned several years, and the FBI and the US government spent massive resources on the case. The case begins when a man named Mo Hailong, or Robert Mo, as he's called in the book, is found in a Monsanto cornfield outside Des Moines. It's a field that's growing next generation genetically modified seed. Monsanto protects that as a trade secret. And his appearance there sparks this 2-year investigation involving 70-something agents, multiple states, and then eventually reaches this kind of crazy conclusion. So when I first read about this case, it started in 2011 and kind of came to went to court in 2013 or 2014. And at that time, industrial espionage was not yet this huge flashpoint in the US-China relationship. But the FBI was at the time already going after many often ethnic Chinese scientists for pursuing alleged trade secrets on behalf of Chinese companies or for taking their research to China. And since then, and since the start of the book, that issue has only accelerated to the point where now industrial espionage was one of the drivers for Trump's trade war, or one of the ostensible drivers for Trump's trade war with China. It was one of the supposed reasons for shutting down the Houston consulate, the Chinese consulate there, which that happened in July of this year. And that was a fairly unprecedented move on behalf of the US government. One of the major reasons they gave was that that consulate was deeply involved in industrial espionage. So it's this issue that is cited again and again by national security types, and that has only accelerated under the Trump administration. But I think we can learn a lot by looking at this specific case of Robert Mo, the guy who's found in this cornfield, because his case gets at a lot of questions that are really swirling around this issue. One is that these cases are brought on behalf of very large US corporations, often conglomerates. So in this case, Monsanto, and there was another defendant company in the case, which was DuPont Pioneer. And so, the seed industry is one where there has been just immense consolidation over the past few decades, where farmers have gone from having dozens of seed companies to just a few today. Even over the period that I was reporting out this book, Monsanto was acquired by Bayer, the German conglomerate. And so now it's no longer even a US company. And so that raises these issues where the US government is the one assuming the costs in these cases. They are brought under the argument that they're protecting US innovation, that Chinese companies are going after the fruits of US research and hard-earned labor on behalf by US scientists. And yet, at the end of the day, multinationals in the West at least know no borders. And unlike, say, Huawei or some of the bigger Chinese companies that are tied to the Chinese government and have very little choice about leaving China, US corporations and multinationals in the West don't really know that sort of allegiance. And so the case and others like it bring up this issue of, is spending all of these resources on these cases, and there have been really hundreds over the past 10 years. Is that the best way to protect innovation in the United States? Or, you know, are there better ways, like perhaps even breaking up some of the larger corporations? You know, it's not to say that trade secret stuff from China is not a problem. You know, as I show in the book, Robert Mo and his colleagues devoted immense energy to trying to steal the seed. You know, at one point, they bought farms in the Midwest. They posed as farmers. They didn't necessarily fit in, or really, you know, people didn't necessarily believe that they were local farmers, but they went to seed stores and buy seed. And they, at one point, tried to smuggle the seed back to China in microwave popcorn bags. So there are all these kind of, at points, harebrained antics that they carried out for the goal of stealing the seed and then bringing it back to China, trying to reverse engineer it there, which is a fairly complex process. But at the same time, the resources that the FBI and the US government expended on the case were just immense. So at one point, the FBI actually flew airplanes overhead to conduct surveillance on them. The FBI has this fleet of unmarked planes that it uses throughout the country, and these were put into service trying to tail Robert Mo and his colleagues as they were driving across cornfields. There were these kind of very dramatic airport busts that involved pulling one of Robert Mo's relatives away from her children and then putting the children on a plane by themselves back to China. And, you know, all of this was done in service of a company's trade secrets, which previously something that would have been protected through a lawsuit. Instead, we have criminalized trade secrets theft, and people are going away to prison for many years, in some cases upwards of 10 years. Robert Mo himself was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison. He, you know, spent a fair amount of time talking with him about the case, and so his point of view comes out as well. And, you know, and also trying to get the FBI's point of view into the story as well. But then since that case concluded, there has been something launched under the Justice Department called the China Initiative, which really has resulted in many more of these cases being brought, and of many cases involving US researchers at universities, who are often, you know, sometimes taken grants from the Chinese government that they did not report, and those instances have been criminalized as well. And, you know, I think this raises a lot of real questions, especially in the context of the Trump administration. Really, it's quite complicated, right? The Trump administration is really going after China on the technology issue, but you also have rising nationalism and tightening authoritarianism within China under Xi Jinping. And so two superpowers really at loggerheads over this issue of technology. I thought what Stephen mentioned about mirroring is really interesting. One Cold War historian that I spoke to in the process of doing research mentioned that mirroring is really a feature of the Cold War, and that's something that I think we increasingly see with the US and China. So where even China has had its own campaign to go after so-called foreign spies, and, you know, particularly for Chinese Americans, this can be very difficult because they're kind of caught in the middle in both the US and China. So the instances where researchers have been imprisoned in China, these are by and large Chinese American researchers. And the same is true in the United States. This just quickly, because I want to leave time for questions, but the second piece I wrote was actually just a Q&A with Sam Hoffman, who is a researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra, and that institute does really fascinating research. They, in my opinion, have some of the best work out today on Chinese technology. Some of the blockbuster stories that you see in the news from time to time, they routinely come from this institute. And so I talked to her about her research, looking at how the CCP collects data. And she wrote this really fascinating report getting into the CCP, so the Chinese Communist Party's use of language and translation technology overseas. So these seemingly benign technologies that are used to collect data. And she mentioned the party just kind of sweeps up the data and then worries about what to do with it later. We also talked about TikTok, which at that point was more of a fringe security concern for people who worked on Chinese technology. And then, since then has really blown up into a somewhat irrational policy discussion. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Konstantin.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Mara. And I should mention as well, besides Mara's book, which is out, Sonia, you also have a book coming out in January, correct? Called The Good Girls and Ordinary Killing, which I also encourage people to get. So I think, and Stephen, you do as well, actually, right? I'm blanking on the title of your book momentarily, but we should.
The Rise of
everybody's book.
Yeah.
So coming back, I think one thing we haven't talked about too much yet is the role that multilateral institutions can play, which is, I think, there's, for the past sort of half century plus since World War II, the paradox that power ultimately still resides with national governments and not with the UN or UN bodies, and yet they are quite important in certain ways in shaping the technological world, in making things like telecommunications interoperable, that you could, even during the Cold War, you could send mail back and forth between the Soviet bloc and the American bloc. And multilateral institutions, like everything else in the world, are changing. I think the WHO was a particularly acute example of how the Trump administration could seek to sort of undermine the authority and influence of a multilateral body that otherwise might have been more influential than it has been. And I kind of wanted to ask each of you to sort of reflect from where you sit on which multilateral bodies are of potential importance in working towards outcomes that are broadly in the public interest, and how that might look like. I think of something like the both intragovernmental organizations like the UN and UN agencies, and NGOs, which have a certain global scope. And I know that in India, Sonia, the Modi administration has had a very contentious relationship with foreign NGOs over time. So Stephen, maybe we could start with you to sort of talk a little bit about multilateral specifically, and then any other comments that Mara, you and Sonia might want to add.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks. It's a good question, and I think it's really one where you're seeing this kind of contestation play out, and I think there's increasing concern that you're sort of seeing rival camps make a push, particularly a China-led push against what has otherwise been a relative degree of consensus when it comes to, well, I mean, actually, what's funny is not even consensus, but I think for a long time it was fairly apolitical when it came to agreeing upon certain technical standards when it comes to telecommunications, for example. And partially that's because so much of industry was dominated by the US and other advanced industrialized countries that there wasn't really much of a debate to be had. As China has developed a rival industrial sector, and as it also sees its power tied very strongly to its ability to promote advanced networks, other telecommunications, other internet and telecommunications infrastructure. You're seeing a shift in I think a fair degree of aggressiveness in bodies like the ITU, WIPO, some of these different working groups tied to cybersecurity, where China and other entities are really pushing for their own standards and even different ways to rethink internet protocols, so that the ability for countries to really control in a much more definite way and have kind of sovereign ownership over their internets is becoming more and more of a possibility the further along we get. And so, it's funny because on the one hand, I think people could look at multilaterals and they start to yawn and they think, well, what does this really matter? It's a bureaucratic exercise that has very little to do with the day-to-day issues that we grapple with. But on the other hand, these decisions will have far-reaching consequences in terms of what companies are able to advance what types of technologies, how those technologies will then be incorporated in the systems we rely upon, and ultimately how we are able to communicate across different countries and globally because of a fracturing or a potential fracturing of the internet and related ideas. So it's a big deal, and yet also very technical and somewhat opaque.
I don't know if either of you wants to weigh in on this.
It's really hard to say anything definitive from the Indian perspective right now, because the country is in such a state of flux. It's changing so rapidly, and India, like a lot of developing countries, has aspired to recognition from global institutions. Has aspired to be a part of these large institutions and to have a voice. But I think that is changing now. I think the country is looking inward. I think the country is on this sort of path where it's more interested in its own history. It's more interested in creating its own mythology. It's more interested in a narrative in which it boosts itself up, not in relation to other countries in the world, other movements in the world, but in relation to other people in India, in a way that the competition is within India itself. And I think that India is in a process right now of increasingly isolating itself. And we will not, at this rate, you and I, have this conversation about India's place in the world by the end of Modi's term, because I don't think that India will either have a significant place in the world as it did during, Dr. Manmohan Singh's tenure, when India was spoken about as a potential economic superpower. I think we will be talking of the place that Indians themselves occupy in India. That conversation will become, that is how the conversation is going to move. And you mentioned amnesty, and I think that is also part, amnesty, as our viewers may know, has wrapped up operations in India. Foreign human rights organizations and Indian human rights organizations play a critical role in India, because there are systems set up to protect people, to uplift the poor, and so on and so forth, but they cannot function on their own. I mean, it requires all hands on deck, and Amnesty has done so much for, among other people, political prisoners. The Modi government has frozen its accounts. Amnesty has been forced to fire its staff. They have essentially wrapped up their affairs in the country. And the former head of Amnesty India has had charges filed against him for a tweet in which he encouraged marginalized communities to follow the example of BLM protesters in the United States and stand up for their rights. So this is where we are. So, the question of what is India's place in the world, India is not in that position that it was prior to Modi.
Something like angling for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council or something like this.
I think that on one hand, India angles for those things. On the other hand, it makes its position increasingly untenable, because you cannot, you cannot be that government. You cannot be those people who encourage genocide against your marginalized communities. And as we saw, there was a pogrom in Delhi that targeted Muslims during Trump's visit. I mean, Trump was having dinner with Modi when a pogrom was sweeping the national capital, killing dozens of Muslims. I mean, the level of impunity is extraordinary. So, there may be the aspiration, it may be part of a conversation, but the fact is that those two things don't go together. You cannot be a part of the world while at the same time disemboweling yourself, and then also refusing to change it, refusing to accept any criticism. I mean, what makes all of this so complicated is that certainly the first time he was elected, Modi was democratically elected. There are questions about the most recent election. But there is only so much that you can say to a country that is, calls itself the world's largest democracy. I think that what India is going to continue to do is to walk that line very carefully, where where other governments, where the big global institutions will not feel entirely confident in saying that it is no longer a democracy. India will continue to walk that line. That pretense will continue. But I just don't see, I think it is disappearing off the map. I think it is fading. It is regressing into a place in its own history where it feels comfortable, and so therefore these questions are becoming moot.
I mean, there's a big irony in that, I guess, right? Because that's exactly the opposite of what Modi's sort of stated ambitions for India are, as I understand them, right?
I mean, this is the difference between Modi's stated ambitions and then the stated ambitions of China. Modi's stated ambitions are not actually his stated ambitions. Modi is a Hindu nationalist. He wants a Hindu India. Now, whether those Hindu Indians are employed, whether they create a juggernaut of an economy, whether we really are going to be in a position to compete with China or not. These are not at all questions that are relevant to his comprehension, his desire for the country that he wants. They don't interest him, and even if they interested him, this is not a man who has the mind to make anything happen. We have seen he's a disaster. He does not understand anything other than the building of temples and the creation of a Hindu state. There is no comprehension, no engagement. There is only talk. And also, the people who enabled this talk, the journalists in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, the PR companies that supported him, the non-resident Indians who poured money into his campaign. Nobody now feels comfortable openly supporting him. So even that facade has fallen, because you see it happening with Trump as well. I mean, nobody competent wants to align themselves with Trump. Similarly, in India, nobody competent wants to align themselves with Modi. So it's one man and a temple at this point.
I wonder just in particular about this question of competence and the Modi administration, insofar as it concerns technology and manufacturing in particular. If you could maybe take us through a little bit of, and if this is a sort of off-topic question, feel free to say so. But I was thinking of the Make in India program and how Modi set out to invigorate domestic manufacturing a few years ago, and how I suspect that has not unfolded the way that he had hoped it might.
No, I think what happened with Modi, and you see this with authoritarian leaders, is there is it seems almost unbelievable now in retrospect that any of that happened and that it was believed, because it was really all PR. And we know it's all PR because there is no, there's nothing. There is nothing. It was literally like, you were invited to the cinema to watch a film start at a certain time, and here we are years later, and there is no sign of that film. There's no sign of nothing. So of anything. So an enormous amount of money was solicited from an enormous number of people in India and abroad, including, India's top industrialists, and including the powerful, privileged, money-rich Indian American population in the US, to build a campaign. But there was nothing other than that, because to implement a campaign, you need capable minds. And starting with India's economic advisor, to Amartya Sen, who's won a Nobel Prize in economics, and to several other Indian Nobel Prize winners, they have all been treated like they simply know nothing, because that is how it is. An authoritarian figure will not tolerate anybody else sitting at the table. So there really is nothing to show for that PR. There is just money spent. And you recall Modi's brilliant idea to vanish almost the entirety of India's paper currency, that killed more than 100 people, that destroyed small businesses. This is a country that runs on cash. Even when people buy things on Amazon and the Amazon delivery driver shows up at your doorstep, you pay him in rupees. You haven't paid for that transaction online. India runs on cash. People do not trust online transactions. And he destroyed small industry with demonetization. And now we've had the pandemic, and there was talk about putting in an enormous amount of money boosting the pandemic economy. And that's not happened. The projections for India are worse now than for Bangladesh. So, and the IMF just made that projection yesterday or the day before. So there is nothing. That is what Indians are going to have to reflect upon. There is nothing.
So as you're
outlook, yeah, Mara, please.
Yeah, as Sonia is describing some of what's happening in India, it does really bring up parallels in the United States and really around the world. And even in China, as there is this much more ambitious plan to that's outward facing and sort of taking advantage of the control that they've gotten on the pandemic to make inroads in other places, railroad Hong Kong, all of that pushed through standards and in multilateral bodies. At the same time, there is also rising nationalism within China and this turning inward. Interestingly, if you look at some of the tech policies that the Trump administration has adopted, like the TikTok ban, India did that first. I believe it happened like a few weeks before the Trump administration announced their action on TikTok. India had done the same. And what I remember reading is that as soon as TikTok was banned, people were just downloading all of these Chinese competitor short video apps. And these actions that are taken by the Trump administration, I think, really undermine the credibility of the United States on this issue. The issues that the technologies like TikTok, for example, have been of immense concern to people who work on this issue for many years. I think there was a lot of blowback toward toward the TikTok ban, and people saying, well, it's just a short video app. What kind of harm does it do? It's just used by teenagers. But this is an incredibly sophisticated technology. There's a lot of evidence that the way the company has operated overseas has been effectively controlled from China. There is evidence that they've censored content that is offensive to Beijing, videos on Xinjiang and videos on Hong Kong. And all of this discussion was happening and bubbling up for years before Trump waded into the issue. But I think the problem is that he wades in with such kind of unpredictability and such really ill thought out policies that people, especially on the left, immediately push back and think, well, you know, there must be nothing wrong with TikTok, that Trump is just vilifying it. And so that, you know, indirectly then aids the Chinese Communist Party, and really we end up ignoring all of this discussion that we should be having about these technologies. And, you know, granted, we need to have a discussion about some of the platforms developed in the United States and their consolidation of power. All of that needs to happen as well. But there are very real concerns about specific Chinese technologies.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Mara said, you know, I think I agree that the incoherence of what Trump has tried to accomplish, you know, with regard to TikTok, for example, you know, speaks to, I think, to me, kind of a bigger kind of problem in that, you know, I feel like the Trump administration kind of wants it both ways when it comes to technology, in the sense that they both want to make an argument that TikTok and other types of applications stemming from China threaten U.S. national security, and therefore it's within the national interest to push back on these types of applications and to take necessary steps to counteract them. So fine, that's a geopolitical argument. They also try to make the argument as well that it's a democracy human rights issue, that stopping these apps from proliferating, essentially because they serve as the long arm of the Communist Chinese Party, is essentially then a way to counteract authoritarianism worldwide. And I think a lot of countries, certainly in my conversations abroad, in places that sort of feel like they are not completely in the midst of either one of those, you know, feels like they're sort of being subject to this kind of great power rivalry, and that they suffer, you know, the impact of this rivalry, and they don't necessarily understand what the benefits are for them. And so I think part of it is just that we don't understand exactly, when it comes to these types of actions, what exactly the purpose and end goal is, and what the objectives are when it comes to this kind of tech policy. You know, I would also mention as well, you know, when it comes to you know, the kind of way to differentiate, you know, I think a lot of people have had a problem with the fact that that the Trump administration has targeted two specific applications or platforms, as opposed to sort of setting out broader ground rules and saying applications that, you know, lack sufficient data privacy protections, applications that have links to governments that commit grave human rights violations, applications that threaten the national security in X, Y, or Z way, will then have extra scrutiny applied to how much they will be permitted to operate in the US. I think having clear-cut rules that apply across the board, that certainly would be relevant to WeChat and TikTok, but maybe other applications as well, I think that would feel more legitimate than just simply naming and shaming a particular set of countries for interests that aren't completely clear.
Not having resolved any of these issues, I wanted to take a little bit of time to relay a few questions from our audience. The first is from a person, I suspect this is not his or her real name, Dutch_NHL, who asks whether data safe havens are possible at a national level, services in pro-privacy countries, somewhat like tax havens. Be curious what any of you think about that. Maybe Mara, you know, in particular, talking about the report of Sam Hoffman that you were mentioning about how pervasive the Chinese technological surveillance around the globe is, and not just within the national borders of China. So I at least am skeptical about the possibility of national safeguards of data privacy, but would want to hear what the rest of you have to say on the subject.
Yeah, I do think we're in a very difficult moment where in many cases with especially when it comes to certain technologies and to platforms, people are made to choose between the United States and China. And the analysis that we're getting on these platforms is coming from one or the other as well. And that's very fraught. Increasingly some of the information coming out of not just the Trump administration, but people within kind of the national security complex that are close to the administration. I think that's also colored by the growing conflict with China. I mean, the EU may provide a kind of in-between point, and obviously, and they do have, of course, better data governance in general. One analysis I've heard of why they've been able to push through strong regulations on data governance is because they do not have one of the major platform companies. It's a lot easier to regulate Facebook and Google when they're not these homegrown entities. So I think Stephen's recommendation of coming up with policies that apply to both Chinese and to US companies is a good one, because some of the solutions that have been floated for TikTok, simply being acquired by Oracle or it doesn't matter what company, it's not really it doesn't really fix the essential problem.
I don't know, Sonia, Stephen, if you want to talk about data privacy in particular. We do have another question, so if you have thoughts, by all means.
Maybe just a quick point. I was doing an event earlier today, and I just wrote a paper that kind of looks at two new policies that are imminent in the EU, the Digital Services Act and the European Democracy Action Plan, that tries to get at some of these issues. I think it's tricky. I agree very much with what Mara said, that in some ways you can create a policy framework in a more seamless way if you don't actually have the stakeholders themselves, which exist in your countries. That also, I think, makes it difficult to exert the type of influence that's needed, though, in terms of moving, corporate practice in a manner that conforms to the privacy standards and priorities within the EU. But I do think that these are important steps that are being taken. And one of the things I mentioned earlier was that, until the U.S. is able to get its house in order on tech policy and on these thorny privacy issues, good for the Europeans to continue pushing forward on that front. I hope that the regulatory side in the U.S. catches up. So far, that's been impossible, and that's been through a combination of, I think, intransigence because of private sector interests, the Trump administration's incoherence on this policy, and the fact that there's a lack of social consensus when it comes to how to actually resolve these problems. I think in time, hopefully that'll get improved. But for now, I think the Europeans are probably further ahead and doing better on this than most others.
So I think we have time probably for just one more question, also from the audience, from a username Ayman AS, who asks about the impact of green parties on technology, and I think maybe of the environmental movement more broadly around the world, even in places where there might not be a green party as such. I don't know, Sonia, if you might want to weigh in on environmentalism in India, or Mara, Stephen, if you have points you'd want to make about the sort of political impact of environmental movements in the parts of the world that you've been thinking about. Feel free to interject or not.
I can't say I've thought like a ton about the specifics, like ecological impact, when it relates to technology. I mean, I do think when I think about sort of transnational movements and the ability of technology to kind of have a positive interaction with these types of concerns, I do think that that's something to me that is relevant. So it's a slightly different take on the subject, but I think the point is that, with the increasing interconnection that we're seeing and the fact that, massive environmental problems that are taking place in different corners around the world have impacts no matter where you live, particularly with regard to climate change. I think ways that we can organize across countries and frankly blunt the impact of techno-nationalism and build cross-regional movements on issues like environmental catastrophes, climate change, and so forth, is crucial. And so, a lot of this conversation has been a little bit pessimistic in terms of where tech policies are going, where politics are going. But I think, the optimism that we can also summon when it comes to technology is its ability to organize and move people together in a more unified way on issues that affect all of us. And my hope is that it is this ability to foster dialogue, political mobilization on these environmental issues in particular, that can show the promise of where technology can go, as opposed to sort of the downside, the negative side of some of the problems that technology has also wrought.
I'll add one remark in answer to Ayman, whom, even though we can't see him, thank you for the question. In that I think I find it very interesting to think about the changing conceptions of what technologies are seen as desirable or undesirable by the environmental movement as it's politically instantiated in green parties. Are genetically modified foods a good technology or a bad technology from an environmentalist perspective? Is nuclear power, good or bad? And I think these, as our political understanding of technology shifts over time, what environmental activists have to say about a given technology can change, right? On the one hand, people were very worried and remain worried for good reason about, say, nuclear waste. At the same time, nuclear power is a potentially extremely powerful tool to have at your disposal in cutting down on carbon emissions. Similarly, there are preoccupations that are reasonable about tampering with the genome. At the same time, this is an incredibly powerful lever for increasing human welfare. And I think these are inflected differently in different parts of the world at different times. I think we're very near to time. I wanted to give everybody a chance, but not an obligation, to weigh in with any closing remarks that you might have. We can go really in any order. Please feel free to speak up if there's some closing remarks you want to make, and if you don't want to, that's fine also.
Well, I do like the idea of ending on an optimistic note. I think we can do with some optimism, particularly going into November. I think that perhaps certainly in the case of India and other countries that are facing difficulties that have been sharpened by the pandemic, places all over the world, unexpected places. I mean, I'm in London right now, but it's one of those unexpected places where you wouldn't think you would be let down. You didn't think you would be failed by the government. But I think that those of us who find ourselves in that situation, and those of us who are particularly suffering human rights violations, need to find new ways of reaching out and need to find new ways of fostering communities, because technology has turned on many of us. Technology has proved to be unreliable. It's proved to be unsafe. And until somebody can fix the problem, I think we need to find a way to establish the relationships that are not reliant or so heavily reliant. I mean, that's saying something during a Zoom call, but we do need to find a way to establish those relationships and to start movements that are not based on what technology and what the internet can get us, because it has proved to be an unreliable resource for many people, particularly in vulnerable positions.
Mara, I don't know if you have any brief closing remarks. We are slightly on the edge of going over time, so please, by all means, do. But if you don't, I think we're also about out of time, so that's great.
It's fine. I think we can end on Sonia's note.
I think that is a good note of optimism and the building of community. Thank you to the three of you, both for taking the time to do this today, and for the stories in the magazine issue that brought us together here. And thanks to Stephen for organizing the panel, and to Marissa Jordan and everybody else at Carnegie who put it together. And to you, the viewers on our various online platforms, for taking time out of your day to join us. So I wish everybody a good rest of the day.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.